Well, welcome everybody to today's program. My name is Alec Cooley. I'm a senior advisor here with Busch Systems, and I'll be your quote expert for the day, talking about bin labels and signage. This is going to be an informal conversation as we put into the initial outreach email. We do a number of webinars, roughly on a once a month, every other month basis, where we bring in speakers and we deep dive into case studies and more of the talking head style presentation. But we've received a lot of feedback over time that sometimes it's nice just to be able to have a conversation and to sort of share your example and be able to have more of a conversation. So we're thinking this format is kind of akin to office hours. There's the lecture where you get to go and sit down with the professor, and then sometimes it's nice just to come out and have this conversation. So that is going to be the tone for today. It's just going to be casual. We are going to be inviting folks to come up. On the registration form, we asked if you had specific questions that you wanted to address. So there are a couple folks who I've had email exchanges with, and I'm going to invite them to come on first. But then once we're done with that, I'll open it up and encourage anybody else who's on who has a question, as long as we still have time to address that. We'll invite you to come on and we can bring you into the conversation as well. This is obviously this format. We're using more of the traditional meetings version of Zoom, so where everybody has the ability to come on stage. So I just encourage everybody to keep your audio turned off just to avoid the background noise, unless there's a specific opportunity where you have something to speak, then feel free to turn it on. Also, it's not required, but I do encourage, if you do plan to speak at any point, it is helpful to have your video turned on, just to make this feel more like a conversation. So, but not a requirement if you're not a situation where that lends itself to. So before we get started, I'm just going to run through a couple of housekeeping things for background. As I said, this is part of our monthly Green Thinking webinar series, this program. I want to point out just some upcoming things we have in the near future and some other resources outside of today's program. We're doing a program next month that is focused on organics collection from indoor settings. We'll be partnering with the Zero Waste Campus Council, which is an NGO organization made up of sustainability managers at different campuses, both universities and corporate, other examples around the country. We're going to be partnering with them to do this program. This could be a mix of, we're going to have a traditional case study presentation. We're going to be featuring Amy Martman from SBM, which is a company that provides custodial services and works with a lot of different types of clients, talking about best practices for doing collection of organics from indoor settings, some of the nuance and the potential complications that make it distinct from just traditional recycling or waste collections. So invite folks to join for that program. We'll combine her presentation with a breakout group discussion so that, again, trying to make these more interactive. Following her discussion, people will have the opportunity to join separate Zoom breakout rooms and have discussions on different specific topics. So that will be April 6th at 1 p.m. Eastern. And if you're receiving the emails for this program, you should also be seeing something coming into your inbox over the next day or so. Also want to point out, we have a full archive of all the programs we've done over the past year and a half, 2 years. So if you are looking for more of a deep dive into some of these different topics, including, we don't have anything that's been specific to signage to date, but a lot of the programs we've done touch on signage in one form or another, and focus on these narrow settings and sectors like venues, healthcare, as well as outdoor public spaces. So you can find the recordings and slide decks from all those past programs on our website at buschsystems.com. And then also point out that I have a webinar, I have a blog series that I do where as I have time, I sort of deep dive into some of these different topics, again, trying to connect people to resources, some of the knowledge that's out there to how we improve our programs. I've done, I'll touch on this a little bit as we're going through, but I've been working on a project with an old colleague where we've been going through old academic papers that have focused on sort of the science of what gets people to put things into the right bin, including with signage, how you design signage. And so I'm going to be tapping into some of what I've learned from reading some of these in the past today. But just want to point out that I've written a number of blogs that touch on different aspects of this, and you can find these also on our website, including reviewing some papers looking at the value of having signs that go above a bin. The simple placement of where you put signage can have a big impact on getting people to sort things correctly. I've also done a whole series just on the using words versus images and how people process it and use that information differently. So I won't go through all these, but just want to point out that if you go to our website, and I believe my colleague Marissa is also going to drop something into the chat with just a direct link to these. Invite you if you want to take more of a deeper dive into some of these topics. And so this is just an example of, above bin signage. I was mentioning how there's actual science showing this, and these are just an example of some of the research papers that we reviewed, and you can find a whole blog. We also have a fact sheet pulling out some of the highlights from these. For anybody who really wants to take a super deep dive, you're not happy with just getting the sort of the summary version that my colleague and I are able to provide. We've actually assembled and created an online database. It's set up as a Google Sheet. Anybody who wants to can come on here, and you can find a whole list of over 100 different studies that have been done looking at different aspects of signage as well as bin design, all with an orientation around how do we use those to influence people's sorting behavior and encourage people to recycle. So this is definitely, you're going way down a rabbit hole if you decide to go into these, but for those I know, it's not just myself who likes to dive into some of these. So Marissa is also going to drop the link to access this Google Sheet into the chat as well for those who want to check it out. So I'm gonna get started in just a moment and invite the first person to speak. But before I do, let me just start by just going over some very high level principles, because some of this is pretty universal across the board when we talk about how we use signage and labels. And so we'll start out by, first of all, the reason we do this in the first place is because we are trying to get people to put things into the correct opening of a bin. Contamination is a big problem. People tossing recyclables in the trash, big problem. And so what causes that behavior? It's not a uniform one size fits all that people just don't care or they're not paying attention. That's certainly the case in for some folks, but I think there's an understanding that there are a lot of different factors that are involved that influence at different points for different people in different situations, causes them to do the correct thing or not. Certainly attitude is a big part of it, choosing to recycle or not. Do you have a convenient alternative? If there's not a recycling bin next to that trash bin, most people are going to use that anyway. It has nothing to do with whether or not they believe in recycling or if they know what's supposed to be sorted where. And obviously people have to have that knowledge. They have to understand what specific items can go where. All that's pretty standard, and I think there's a good appreciation for those. What from my experience, I think gets underappreciated is in on-the-go settings, public space, areas that I would define as not residential or not necessarily your desk side work environment, where whatever bin you might have there, you use on a regular basis. You get to know that system. You are familiar with it. But once you leave work or home, many of us, we tend to be thrown out into a wide world of lots of different programs, different organizations, all setting up different types of bins. They look different. There's different verbiage. There's a lot of confusion that gets involved there. But also when people are moving around, we're busy. We're thinking about other things. And a big factor of why folks do not sort items correctly, from my experience, is simply that they're not paying that much attention. They're just giving a very casual glance. And this is important because I think this goes to the heart of what signage could be doing and how it can address that. I like to refer to what I call sort of this Homer principle, the fact that people just, recycling and trash, as compelling as it might be for myself and some of you who are working this profession, it's just not something that compels people's attention. And so we have just that split second of focus in best case scenario, many situations. And the question is, how do we leverage that time to get people to do what we want them to do? The golden rule when it comes to signage is, keeping it simple and consistent. You can't give people too much information, or you lose them and you miss that opportunity to steer how they sort things. I think it's also important to think about how signage is used, and the fact that it's not just serving one single purpose. It has multiple purposes in a best case scenario. First and foremost, for that person who's not paying attention, they need to understand there's a distinction between two different bins sitting next to each other. They're not the same. They actually have a choice to be made. And so that's the very first thing that a signage does, is to communicate that there is an option that they will have to choose from. Second is they have to ID what those options are. What are the different streams? There's one for trash or waste. There's one for cans of bottles, perhaps, one for organics, whatever that is. But signage also has to play that distinct role. And how you design it is going to be, it needs to serve that purpose. Is a little bit different than this third one, which is just calling out the specific items and shaping expectations about what specific items people should be sorting. I also put down just branding. A lot about recycling, using color schemes and other aspects are really about branding the different streams and getting people to create associations that when they go from one place to the next with consistency, that can play an important role as well. As an example, this was a research, these bins were involved with a research project done by a design student in Vancouver, pointing out these different levels of information and how we communicate them. We want people just to understand there's a distinction between the different streams, that they are for different types of materials. And that's information that people need to see as they're approaching from a distance. You want them to start to form ideas about understanding the difference between the different bins. And so that's where it's helpful having these large messages that you can see from 5 or 10 feet away with just core words or images. Having this image of a coffee cup, the words containers or mixed paper. So that's playing those first roles. The second, though, when you get into the granular level, is it is good in many situations to have those specific details, but you don't need to see that information until you're right up onto the bin. There's no point in trying to communicate that when somebody is 10 feet back. You don't need to have that in huge letters, but for those who are going to pay attention, it's good to have that information. So again, just talking about some very general principles, it's good to keep it simple and consistent. Having just basic words, basic images that are going to stand out. It's also important to know that there's different context. There is no one size fits all from my experience with this. Different people in different contexts, different situations act differently. So as an example, this image on the left is taken from a cafeteria where, let's think about a couple of different things. One, the type of material of waste being generated in a cafeteria is not that diverse. It's going to be the things that are sold inside that cafeteria. So that the vast majority of items are going to be very specific items that are universal. Everybody's going to be handling them. And so that's a situation where you can get much more specific about the information that you need to convey with signs. And also, because there's a relatively small number of different types of items, it's easier to call those out and actually take the time to list those in greater detail versus what I would describe as more of a public space. And so this photo here on the right, this is taken from Seattle Public Utilities. And this is on a street corner where it's a much different dynamic. The types of waste that people are generating it's a Wild West. It's whatever people happen to have in their hand as they walk down. And so that opportunity to get their attention and key them in onto common items is much harder. It's much harder to convey the types of information. And also people are probably less likely to have the focus. They're even less attention they're paying to it because they're literally walking down the street to where they're going. They may just be the most casual glance. in which case it probably isn't worth even bothering to call out even this level of information that you have on the left, because it's just too much information. People's eyes will glaze over. Really, the only opportunity you have in that type of situation may simply be one is for trash, one is for recycling. And so you want to boil that down, that kind of information. So I mentioned that just because, again, there is not a one size fits all, that there are universal rules that will apply in every situation. I think it's also important to know that this is as much an art as it is science. There definitely is some science to this, but a lot of this, what works in one context will not necessarily work in another. We can sort of work from general principles, but a lot of this requires understanding your very specific situation. Doing waste audits and knowing what is in your waste stream can be very important to how you craft your messaging in science. And at the end of the day, signage can help a percentage of people to keep things clean, but even the best signage in the world cannot prevent all contamination, and that's just a reality in terms of setting our expectation. But we can certainly do the best we can with how we design that. So with that, I've talked long enough. So let's go ahead and open things up. As I said, I'm going to start out and invite some specific people on first, and then as we have time, we'll invite others to come on. But first, we have Oge Mas with Vancouver Airport Authority. Okay, welcome. Could you take 60, 90 seconds just to tell us a little bit about your situation and what question that you have?
Sure, thank you. Thanks for the introduction. Hi, everyone. So I work at the Vancouver Airport Authority for Vancouver International Airport. And our issue that we're mostly seeing here is coffee cup contamination in our waste stream. And for us, we have signage that is external, so signage that our passengers will see, or anyone that's interacting in the terminal. And then we have internal signage, so signage that we have for our office spaces and any of our tenant spaces that are in the terminal or satellite offices. So, updating these different, these external, internal groups of signage is challenging, because we want to make sure that we're providing simple, clear information for our internal group, but then also for our passengers, our external signage, it needs to be even more simple and clear, because it's a transient, being at the airport, you're not there to sort your waste, you're there to travel, you're traveling through, you're there for a certain period of time, and then you're gone, and you may not come back for a long period of time. So, we understand that waste is not people's focus. So we do our best to make our external signage as clear as possible, minimal text. Like right now, we only have pictograms to kind of show what goes where rather than text, because we've found that, people don't really pay attention to text. And we thought that, just showing quick photos, or not necessarily actual photos, but quick pictograms of what goes in each bin has been the most beneficial, but we're still having challenges with coffee cups. And our next step is to do a waste audit, like you mentioned, so that we can determine how much contamination we have in our garbage stream that is only coffee cups, and see what other areas where there's more contamination in our waste stream than we'd like to see. And then we can kind of tailor our signage to what we're seeing in our garbage that can be further recycled, and then update our signage to reflect those items. So that's kind of where we're at right now, but just looking to receive any additional, insight or information to help with this challenge.
Yeah. So there are a number of different issues in there, and I'll jump in with a couple of thoughts. Before I do, one other thing I did not mention is that we very much want this to be interactive and conversational. So I'm going to go first and throw out some thoughts, but for everybody else here, if you have observations, we'd love to crowdsource and get your ideas too. So just keep that in mind. If you have things that you want to offer, I'll give you an opportunity in a moment. So one thing I throw out first is just my knowledge about coffee cups and that very specific item. That's one of the problems with coffee cups is that it's one example when you want to call out paper. You want people to recycle paper. you want to keep it as simple as possible. So you might just use just that one word. And the problem is you have this one fly in the ointment, this one item that is very clearly identified as paper that is, as I'm guessing from your waste audits that you've done to date and just anecdotally, you know that that is a major source of contamination in your waste stream. And so it's hard. Now you have to start getting much more specific in your verbiage, which takes up more
space,
more words. And so that creates its own problem. Just as a heads up, coffee cups are an example of where the industry is actually starting to shift. Coffee cups have always traditionally been a no, they cannot go in there. And I can't speak to the MRFs and the sorting facilities in your area, but I know that there is a major effort going now that paper mills across North America are starting to accept coffee cups, and it may quite possibly be in your area, or certainly many areas across the US and Canada, like over the next 2 to 3 years, you're going to start to see coffee cups being accepted, paper coffee cups. So that's just one heads up. And that goes to a second question of, it may not be right now, but it might be a year from now. So how do we set expectations over time with that?
And just to clarify, you're saying that coffee cups will now be accepted in the paper stream, is what you're saying?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
So
okay.
The quick 15-second version is that the fiber that comes in the coffee cup is very recyclable. It's high quality. It's that poly lining on the inside. And it's a combination of newer technologies and just stakeholder engagement within the paper recycling industry are figuring out ways of addressing that so that they can handle it more easily within their system. But they do have technology now that can remove that poly lining so that it can be recycled.
Okay.
But for the moment, it's not recyclable. And so you typically, we would say, with a limited attention span, you don't want to go into the list of no's. You start to list all the different things that don't go in there, you start to lose people's attention span. But this is one example where I think there is value to calling out a specific item where you know it is a significant problem. It's easy to confuse with other paper, and it's a significant enough quantity you're finding in your waste stream that it's worth that effort. And so you may not call out other items that you're finding in your as a contaminant, but cups may be worth one.
We've also considered setting up additional waste bins in certain areas of the terminal that are specific to coffee cups, and placing them strategically in areas where we have Starbucks or Tim Hortons or any other coffee shops, and then just setting up bins that are only for coffee cups, and then we can remove that and put it in the correct stream, and we're hoping that that'll help reduce the contamination. But of course, you're still going to have people that will put garbage in those bins. So
yeah,
I'm not sure what the best thing is to do in this situation.
So I'm pulling up a photo here that kind of applies to this, but one thought I have is the signage that you put on the bin itself, you may want to just keep very specific to the yes items and just keep that limited. But is there something that is almost what you're suggesting as a separate bin is one option, but is there doing a separate sign that's something that it physically just looks different, it stands out, and it doesn't add more information to the essential sign, but it's more of physically it's a pop out, so it grabs people's attention separately. So I pull this out as an example of somebody, they use this for their general messaging, but is that idea something that you can put on the top, or it stands out as a separate to call out that very specific problem material? And again, this is as much art as it is science, and some of what I'm offering is going to be more in the spirit of brainstorming than yes, I can say with scientific certainty this is going to work. But so that is just one thought I throw out there.
Okay.
You also raised the question of using images versus
pictograms.
words.
Yeah.
And so that is something I can share some general thoughts. As I mentioned, I read through with a colleague, went through a bunch of studies that looked at this very question of words versus photographs versus pictograms or icons. I think of those as three different categories. And there's some general rules or some general principles that we found as we were researching through that. We know that we want to be efficient, communicating information as efficiently as possible because people have a short attention span. So it's important to keep in mind that words communicate categories. They're not necessarily specific things versus images, which are a very specific thing. A photograph of a Coca-Cola 20-ounce Coca-Cola bottle is going to communicate a 20-ounce Coca-Cola bottle, but the word bottle communicates a whole wide category of potentially literally 1,000 different things. And so that's important to keep in mind, that they play different roles. I think there's a lot of evidence that images in general are very good at getting people to identify specific things. And so if there are specific items like a coffee cup, or you have a lot of plastic bottles in your waste stream, there's a value to using an image in that situation because it's going to get people to immediately go, I recognize that. That's what I'm doing in my location. So here's an example from I think this is from university, where especially in a situation with like concessions, you understand the packaging that is being generated in that very location. They're using certain types. That's an example where that specificity that an image gives you can be valuable, because when people see it, they will immediately recognize it as the same thing that's sitting in their hand. They don't have to think as much and process to think, does that apply to the situation or not? So there's a real value to using images, using photographs specifically in that kind of situation. The other thing I would say is just the difference between pictures and icons. Icons, again, are more stylized. They're showing you something that is more, let me see if I can find an example. Here's another example where something that's more stylized, that tends to be more similar to a word. It's letting you know it's a broader. It's not necessarily a specific type of bottle. It can sort of represent lots of different types of bottles. And so if I were, say, in a public space setting where you don't have the same consistent type of packaging being generated consistently, that might be where I would lean more towards using icons versus in an area of concessions where it's going to be this specific brand, and there's real value to having that photograph that people will instantly recognize. The problem is if you use a photograph of a specific item in an area where it may or may not ever be an example that they will use. Some of the research found that some people will look at a photograph of a 20-ounce plastic bottle and think, well, I know that plastic bottle goes in there, but does that also include glass? I'm not sure. People get a little wobbly on it, and whether or not they guess correctly in the end, you're asking them to put a lot of thought into something, which is more than most people will do. Their eyes glaze over, they just toss it whichever one is in front of them. So that's where words or icons can be more powerful, is when it's a diverse range of types of materials. You want to give people broad categories. You may miss some of the nuance, but that's just how it is. You can't give everybody 100% of the information they need.
Right. Yeah, it's challenging for us as well because we lean towards having pictograms and no text, other than, the main text like garbage, recycling, just because we're required to translate everything to French as well. So having both text on our waste bins, it takes up a lot of space and then it becomes really cluttered. So, we thought that using pictograms would be the best way to go, so we don't have to worry about translation and then cluttering the spaces with all of these different words. And also, English and French are not the only languages that a lot of our passengers coming through speak. So having those words or that text, it wouldn't really mean much to a lot of people or some people because they may not understand, or you know what I mean? So, there's those challenges as well. So I think we've leaned towards pictograms as well because we have several food courts in the terminal, and then, what's available in those food courts are different at each location. So having specific branded photographs, or even just photographs of what is specific to the food court, is also another challenge because they're not the same in each location. So it's almost like we would have to have signage specific to each food court area. But then, once things change, if tenants change out, then that needs to be updated. So that's not very sustainable in regard to keeping it current and updated. So that's why we've thought pictograms is our best bet, because it's not really that specific to the location, but it's general enough that it captures most of the things that people will encounter wherever they are in the airport.
Yeah, I follow the logic that you're giving, and I probably would lean in that direction as well, because you want it to be, again, consistency is hugely important. So you don't want to necessarily do pictograms of one location in the food court or in general terminal, and then do photographs in a different location, because that right there, you introduce some variables that are more than people can absorb. So I probably would do what you're suggesting.
Okay.
The fact that you're going to do waste audits, I think, is important, because that can help you get to that sort of decision point. If you find that there are specific items like coffee cups or others that you're finding more often are confused, and you can tell they are the kind of things that are ambiguous to people. Plastic, the wrong kinds of plastics are showing up in the recycling bin. That might be an example of wish cycling. People want it to be recyclable, think maybe it might be, but you can start to sparse that. If you're seeing a lot of that contamination of that type, then that might inform what that image looks like.
Yeah, we're a bit behind on doing waste audits, so we'll be doing one coming up in the next few months so that we can have a better assessment. And things have changed quite a bit since going through the pandemic, and a lot of our waste programs have been halted, so we're still getting those back online. But updating our signage is a big thing, because we want to make sure everything is clear and people know where to put their items. But yeah, like you said, waste audit will definitely help inform what we need to change these pictograms to, so that it's reflecting what most people are throwing into our bins. That's our our main focus.
Last thing I'll say, and I want to move on to some other folks. Last thing I would say, just as a general principle, one of the things we found when we looked at comparing words versus images, et cetera, what we found is, at the end of the day, there's value to doing both side by side. And that goes to some of the science behind multimedia learning and how different people absorb and process things differently. And there's some people who lend themselves more to images, some who lend themselves more to words. And there's also, they found that there's a relationship between the words and the images, how they can have a reinforcing role. You might use a broad category like paper on there, but then you want to give images of specific types of paper items that help people to sort of go from understanding a broad category to, here are concrete examples of what that means. So, so as a general rule, I think there's value to doing both together.
Okay.
Yeah. Great. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you.
Okay, let's go ahead and keep moving. I know I have at least two of the folks who I wanted to bring up here. Rashana Shah, are you on? Can you turn on your camera and come on if you are, and go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Rachna Shah. I'm a zero waste consultant in New York City at Common Ground Compost.
Great. So again, we had a quick email exchange beforehand, but can you tell me a little bit about your situation? What are you focused on?
Yeah, so not exclusively, but a lot of the clients we deal with are corporate offices. We're in a place where often some examples are on the signage. My question to you originally was, what if there's a question about some of those example items? And I brought up the example of a compostable salad bowl versus ones that appear to be compostable, but they aren't. However, just even hearing the beginning of this meeting, it seems like to maybe just not include the items like that at all for simplicity's sake. But yeah, we also just deal with the challenge of corporate offices not wanting a lot of or any kind of signage in some cases, besides what's like mandatory. So they want very simplified signage, and you know, in our opinion, it's sometimes too oversimplified, where it's really not giving folks enough information at all. And sometimes they've even leaned on like QR codes, which I just think is a little bit silly, because you're not going to pull out your phone at a way station to kind of, you know, to go see a video, unless you're going to do it on, you know, later out of curiosity. Some things I've recommended are like, well, first of all, is just to have like, rather than a sign that's like formally printed, to maybe have like a frame where you put in a sign, like a paper sign, that so then if you have to make updates, it's not a big cost and it's easy enough to do. Or even just temporary signage when a program launches, just to keep it up for like a month or something, 2 months, until people get used to the new behaviors, and then to pull off the temporary signage and have the more simplified signage. But yeah, that was my situation.
Yeah. Great. So again, some universal themes and what you're raising. Let's start with the packaging, because this oftentimes is kind of a big struggle. Is so we can't give people 100% of the information they need. They don't have the bandwidth. They can't absorb that. But we want to, you know, we know there's specific items we want to call out. And we can't necessarily control the waste stream. You know, in a perfect world, like a special event or a venue where you can work with concessions and, you know, limit the number of types of items to what you are capable of collecting, which allows you to do a very simple, just put it all here kind of message. But where you can't do that, there's sort of a judgment call. And, you know, are there certain materials that they may technically be recyclable, but they're a small enough percentage, your audits show they're small enough percentage, and their likelihood of creating confusion is great enough, you might just leave those out and not even attempt to collect those, understanding that you're going to lose some, you know, some material that's good, and vice versa. There may be items that are contaminant again, but they're easily confused with them, and you might want to call them out. But if it's a small enough percentage, you know, they're not coffee cups that can be ubiquitous, but they're more obscure. You're in a situation where, again, this is kind of triage. It's probably easier to just ignore that and not even try to call that out, because to try and do so and put the level of detail you need to address all those items, you risk losing people altogether. So that's one specific thought I would have, which I think is kind of part of your thinking that you mentioned. Remind me the second thing that you raised. There's another.
And then just while folks are learning a new program, not in the case of OGAs, if I'm saying that correctly, where it's transient spaces but in other spaces where it's the same folks consistently, if you're launching a new program, to like this aspect of temporary signage versus permanent signage, so people can learn a program.
Yeah. I'm a big fan of have that flexibility to change out signage. I think that's huge. I think there's a growing appreciation that if you're going to have permanent signage that you put on there and it's glued on and it's a big hassle to change that, you got to know that your waste stream is not going to change. But waste streams change, recyclability changes over time. That's just a reality, and that becomes a real challenge when people have short attention spans, but long memory. And so when the messaging starts to change, that could be a real problem. There was a university I know of that spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to put really nice little placards of what could go on into the bins. They glued them to the wall, and it was going to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to change that out. So they were reduced to just putting tape over certain items when they can no longer go in. So I definitely would endorse bin styles that allow you to switch inserts and evolve that over time. Yes, and then as far as different audiences, with consistency, we want to balance consistency and also flexibility. Some stuff is very localized to a situation. I think one way I've seen that done is with I know Arizona State University, and I've seen some others where they're able to help maintain consistency by using the exact same verbiage or the exact same images, no matter where it is on their campus. But what they do is they understand in specific settings, there are certain materials that are more ubiquitous, more likely to happen. And so they may emphasize those and leave off other items that you're not finding in that location on the signage that goes into that location. But at least you're able to maintain consistent branding and consistent verbiage so that when people, again, using the coffee cup as an example, if you were to call that out in a cafeteria versus a football stadium, if you're going to use them at both in different locations, you're going to use the same image, the same type of verbiage, but you don't have as much coffee being served in a football stadium. So you may leave that off of the sign and have that interchangeability. Some other thoughts I would have is, I think in a situation that's a more stable, people are using that more consistently. The workstation, the bin that's in their hallway that they walk past every single day, there may be more value in that situation to listing more information than you would on a street corner. As I showed the example of the bins from Seattle, there's no point in even trying to get people more information on a street corner if they're never going to come back to there again, or in an airport. But if it's something where they're going to use that bin over and over again over the time period, to the extent that they absorb that information, it's going to be consistent and they're going to use that over time. So there's a greater opportunity to make somebody more informed, as it were.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, I would also say for you had excited, or gave the example of restaurants, back of house versus front of house. I think the same principles apply very much to the back of house. Service workers need to also have something that's simplified and not asking them to have to relearn things over again. So applying the same consistent verbiage, consistent wording on bins, color coding, having the waste bags that are pulled out of the liners, use blue bags for recycling, green for organics, et cetera. And having the dumpsters that they go into have that are also ways that you help to address that back of house.
Love it.
So I'll throw it open again. If there's anybody who has any other thoughts they want to offer up in the situation, go ahead and unmute yourself and just jump in. I see a note here just in the chat. They're looking at similar creating a cup share opportunity with larger coffee chains, Starbucks, et cetera. Good. Well, I hope that helps answer some questions. Or is there anything else you would raise or question you have?
I actually have a small question. In that scenario where someone's going to repeatedly see the sign, I also was toying with the idea of providing a small factoid that gives them a little bit of a reason as to why this is important. It would, just be something at the bottom that's like the average viewer would probably just miss, but someone who's more interested might actually read. And that was actually my question. Like, some people will just not care to read, and you want to provide a very simplified, but others are interested, right? So it's like, I wanted to try to serve both audiences somehow. But just wondering if you've ever run into signs that provide even just like you're fighting climate change by sorting, or any kind of why or rationale behind doing the action.
Yeah, excellent question. Let me pull up the screen share again. sort of more of the motivational messaging. It's not the instructions, the how, what, but it's more the why. As a general rule, you have to be careful. Providing any more information than people need to just do the basic decision can be a challenge. I think you're more capable of getting away with doing that, again, in more of an office setting where people are using that more over time. They have a base set of expectations that aren't shifting around. And I think how you display it can also be important. So here's some examples that might apply. This image here on the right is from, I think it's Boston, the subway system in Boston, where, again, you have the recycling bins and you have the messaging about what goes in. And then above it, they've got this big thing that is talking about you're recycling one aluminum can, saves enough energy, et cetera. So it's sort of serving that role. To me, though, as I approach this in a subway setting, you're very easy to be distracted and you're on the run. You're trying to catch your train. Does this potentially, because of its position so close to the openings, does that create potential? Are you going to lose more people by distracting them so they miss the core information than you gain because you've motivated them? I probably would not do that in this situation. Similarly over here, where these bins here are talking about your soda can becomes a tonic can, and great messaging that can help motivate people, but it's right here. Does it distract from the fact that you want people to put paper into here, cans and bottles here? Can you even see that verbiage in relation to the much more dominant message? So that's, again, an example I don't think works. Here's an example of what I've seen that I think does work better. And again, it's about positioning. So these are in the football stadium at Arizona State. And I liked how they did this, where the direction where people actually are looking at the bins, where they can see the recycle sign, they can see the symbol, or this is compost. So they know there's a choice, and where that information, the critical information for that instance that they need to absorb, that's what they see as they approach the bins head on. Somebody who's standing on the side, take this angle here on the right side, you want to communicate, reuse your bottles. It's not something that has anything to do with recycle, but it is complementary. It's more akin to a motivational message. The angle that people see these is not necessarily the same angle as somebody who is standing there getting ready to make a choice. So you're looking for a different opportunity to convey that information other than the instant where they're having to make that decision, if that helps.
That's really cool.
The other thing
are those Busch bins?
These are not here, no. I'm showing sort of general range of bins. I'm honestly not sure who these are. Yeah.
Thank you.
The one other thought I would share, where I've seen of doing this kind of motivational or messaging that's not just the information of what, but more the why. These are instances of different communities where they did stenciling on the ground. The feature is in your hands. So it's in that it's close enough that it's in the context of recycling, but it's separate. It's physically separate, and people can have focus their attention on that, or they can focus it on the information about what goes into the bin that's on the bin itself. And again, this is more me sort of putting my judgment and the art side of the equation. I think this is more likely to not distract people from the core information of what to do. You're putting it on a sign as opposed to having it right around the opening, et cetera. So, great.
Thanks, that was really helpful.
Okay, thank you. Good. Then let me come back to, I'm trying to bring back up my notes again. Just to keep moving on, do we have Jennifer Fixon? Are you on the line? If you are, go ahead and unmute yourself. And
hello, hi, I'm Jessica Fixon. I'm the sustainability manager at Harvard Business School, and we're currently redesigning our commencement waste bins. We have been looking into if it's possible to do at this scale 3D signage. Ideally, we'd love to have the actual items that are being given out attached to the boards. We have a decently large campus, and we have a a lot of waste stations to help accommodate the different areas that people are eating lunch. So last year we had 28 waste stations. Each station has trash, recycle, compost. They're given food when they're there. They get a meal. The meal is in a compostable box. So everything we give them is compostable except for their water bottle, which is recyclable. And then we also, sort of similar to as we were talking about like with the coffee cups, the issue we tend to run into is our water cups, which are bioplastic and are compostable, but confuse everyone because they look like a plastic cup. So like so much signage, photos of the cup, compost your cup on the and it's just in the recycle bin. So those are the two issues we're sort of facing. One is knowing that we have to redesign our sign, hoping to do 3D, but we know that we haven't like found other examples in Googling of like 3D event signage, not just 3D like in a cafeteria signage. And then the other side of that is also recognizing like the confusing items.
Yeah, yeah. So another set of excellent questions. And so I'm going to do a screen share again, just to pull up innovation so folks have a sort of a sense of what we're talking about. These are showing boxes here. You can see this is taken from, you mentioned a cafeteria as an example, and this is from the local medical university here, and I'm in South Carolina, and I took these photos of how they had created these shadow boxes that allowed them to put the specific items in. And again, in the same logic that applies to using photographs of specific things, it's even more so in this case. You know, if the idea is by making something concrete and easily recognizable, you speed up that with that split second of attention, people recognize that much faster. They're more likely to react and absorb that. And you know, a 3D item is it's going to do that even better than a photograph will. And so that's the value of having these shadow boxes. These also give you the flexibility as your program evolves over time and you have to add and drop items. This is a lot easier to just open this up and take the bottle out and replace it with something else when something changes than with signage that you have to reprint, et cetera. So there's definitely that's the value of the whole concept of doing 3D boxes, and where again, where these work is where you have a largely uniform, consistent waste stream. The materials that are in there are going to be the ones that people are using. It's not a Wild West where people are bringing whatever they have. I would not necessarily try to do this on a street corner, for many reasons, but it would not have the same impact. And so I definitely endorse doing that idea. I'm not aware of anybody who manufactures these as just a off-the-shelf product that are designed for bins. All the instances I've seen are doing these as just fabricated using your facilities or working with an offsite vendor. So that just is a general principle. That's I think the value of 3D shadow boxes. So tell me a little bit more, Jessica, about what you're saying with the cups. And so you have compostable items. Are there compostable cups and also plastic recyclable cups being served in the same location, or?
No, so it was the caveat of, I feel like pandemic has caused some issues in our dining hall where sourcing isn't as consistent as it used to be, and we'd like it to be, and it's working to get back to. But at commencement proper, all of the plastic cups are bioplastic. They're compostable. They're not being given any cups that go in the recycle bin. They just we have a very international student population, so we have a very international group of people at commencement where family and friends are coming in. So for a lot of them, like they don't have compostable cups anywhere in their radar of like previous experience. And so they're just sort of like bypassing the visual signage and just putting it in the recycle bin.
Yeah. I mean, some situations become intractable, and there's sort of these tensions between the different, the different interests in what we're trying to accomplish. We're trying to, you cited that example of, a business may not want to have big prominent signage on their bins in a location, and so there's always that tug and pull. And as the sustainability person who's trying to come up with a clean waste stream, it's you're having to push back against this. To some degree, the best we can do is communicate to stakeholders and decision makers, whatever that choice is, you just know that this has a direct impact on the stream. And this is about, a functioning system. I like to think of this as just like energy or water. If you wanted to achieve its objective, collect clean, well segregated material, you've got to be able to do these best practices or you don't, but just accept that you're going to have a very contaminated stream, and you have to think of that as part of the decision, and some will be willing to be influenced by that, some won't. Specific to your situation, Jessica, that applies to, can you influence what is actually being served in? If 90% of everything is compostable, what can you do to get that last 10% to also be compostable? Or vice versa, if 90% is recyclable, do you really want a compostable packaging? Can that be affected on the front end upstream side as opposed to the signage? Because there's no getting past the essential difficulty of getting people to absorb more information than they can in that moment. Signage can't fix everything. Sorry, that is not giving a very concrete answer for the situation, but that helps. Is there any other point that you would make around this?
I guess a question for the group is, if anyone has seen at scale compostable single serve waters, so we've got right now the exception to our everything's compostable is our water bottle, because we haven't been able to find fully compostable option. I've seen a couple starting to pop up in Europe. I've seen some that are in containers that say they're recyclable in some municipalities, but not in my municipality. So just sort of, because that, I think, as you were saying, I agree, if we could get it so that we don't have to make that little caveat, we can just say everything we gave you is compostable, then that would help simplify the messaging and hopefully help be like, oh, everything, and not have them think that way. But we haven't found a solution for water bottles yet.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any. If anybody else does, please drop something into a bottle. Yeah, Rashawn, you're pointing out the obvious, which is
we do have refill stations at our primary locations, and they're portable, but they're really cool refill stations that come, these water trucks, but it's not every location that we have. And then often they're the initial bottle that they're then refilling, and the cups like that. So.
Yeah.
Can I just say that I don't know if this aspect is a feature or kind of a background element of the event, but it would be nice if someone's saying, and this event is in the beginning when they're announcing, and they're and this event is, we're really prioritizing sustainability, everything in your lunchbox is compostable. If someone says that at the onset and they're speaking to everybody, then they've already delivered the message at that point. So the sign is just kind of corroborating that. I don't know, but I don't know if they have time amongst all the other things they have to say.
Yeah, it's a good point. Certainly, in terms of getting people to absorb information, one thing we know from behavior research is the more people receive a message from different directions at different points in time, there's that reinforcing aspect. The hearing multiple times is important. I mean, that's sort of politics 101 of consistent talking points, and when people hear it from different directions. That's a really good point. I love when, for instance, arenas and football games, when there's an opportunity to be able to run videos or have messages on the scoreboard that help to reinforce that message. can be really powerful alongside what they might see on signage, or having volunteers hearing, getting messaging from different directions definitely is going to be absorbed more readily. Yeah, good. So we don't have a specific time, cutoff, but generally we were thinking this as being an hour-long program. But I'm certainly willing to stay on if there are others who have questions that either weren't submitted in advance, or if you just want to raise things. I invite folks to stay on and go and unmute yourselves and just jump in, and we can keep this open for another 10 to 15 minutes if folks want. So if anybody wants to speak up, go ahead. And if not, again, feel free to, what I can do just is sort of just take a few minutes. I've got sort of what I think of as almost like a blooper reel. If it helps, just to coming back to some of the general principles. Let me do screen share one more time. So I'm just going to sort of talk through some of these slides of different images and just share kind of general impressions. If it helps to, a lot of this, there's a huge amount of nuance to these, and how different things apply in different situations. So I'll just talk through and share some of my experience. So starting with this one, we talked about, actually I need to actually share it. So we talk about keeping messaging simple. I think one thing that I often see that is sort of an unintended consequence that folks sort of self-inflicted wound is assuming that you can put more information on there than is really needed, that you need to explain things. Again, that efficiency of what you're communicating is huge. So with a situation like this, you have to ask, this starts getting busy. Do you need to have the words, please toss into the blue opening? Are those words essential? So that's something to stop and think about. Is that adding value, or is it potentially distracting people from the core information? If you hear right here where it says dirty items, is that a core? Is that essential information, or is it not? And it's not. Again, some of this is judgment call. Do you need to have the word only after trash, or is trash self-explanatory enough? Anything that you can strip away that is not conveying the most critical information in this context, to me, starts becoming a distraction. Having the word products after paper, same thing. So that's one thing I would offer. You already looked at these bins. Some other points. Too little information, or too hard to see. Having this little recyclable symbol, in theory, you could say everybody recognizes the recycling symbol. You can clearly see that as you walk up, and therefore people will know that this bin on the left is the recycling, and that's the trash. But the reality is that when you have something that's shrunk down that small, down at knee height, that's not going to get the attention and direct sorting behavior for nearly as many people as when you have it up closer, up high, closer to eye level, right next to the opening, large and prominent. And again, there are situations where that's just not an option. You're having to make these trade-offs with aesthetics. But as a general principle, the more you can apply these aspects, the cleaner you're going to keep your material. With this image, normally I point to this as an example of the placement is critical. The bins have to be right next to each other. If somebody is approaching from the left side, they're going to use that blue bin before they ever even see the black bin for trash. But in the context of signage, how you display messaging on the bins itself is hugely important. The lids on these bins, both are very clear and have great messaging, trash, recycling, calling out the specific items. But the person who is on the go, walking down the street, their attention span may simply be as they are approaching from 10 feet away. By the time they get to the bin, their attention may already be focused and going the opposite direction. So you wouldn't necessarily put your long list of all the items you want to collect on the side, but you want to have something. You're not seeing any reference to recycling or trash at all until you're immediately up onto the bin. At that point, a certain percentage of people are already moving on. So, and then there is the just too much information. Again, we've already kind of covered this, but just showing examples. This one here was a photo from a bin in a movie theater. Again, a context where people probably have less attention span than they do in others. Having that laundry list of items and really small print there is going to be ineffective. And just another one showing too much information or distracting information. This image here on the left, what stands out to me is when you start to crowd items in. So just visually having items be sort of overlapping the way they are. Again, it's how fast people comprehend. If people have to stop and focus attention to understand, okay, that's a plastic bottle labeled on top of an aluminum can, on top of that slows people down. You're going to lose folks more readily in that context. What I do like about this is it's just show an example. If I can increase this where you can see where they've called out liquids in this case. And whether or not that's a situation you want to do in yours, this is an example where if that is a chronic problem, like coffee cups, in your specific situation, you don't want to list out a long list of no's, but it may be calling out a very specific item. I would carve that out. I would, if nothing else, give it its own shadow box, something that makes it feel separate than just having it alongside everything else. If you have an image of one type of glass bottle or a plastic bottle, do you need to have an image of a second one? Can you just simplify that to a single image of a bottle? Is that good enough that people will absorb that? It's less distracting. That may work in some situations. And again, this is where waste audits come in handy. If you have, if there's a lot of glass bottles showing up in your waste stream along with plastic bottles, then maybe you do want to call out and have glass. But if there's no glass, it's a situation that only collects plastic bottles, you don't need to have an image of a glass bottle. That's, again, another opportunity to simplify it. And so understanding your waste stream is can be real important to how you design your signage. These are just examples of just self-inflicted wounds of introducing the wrong information, confusing information, not thinking it through clearly. This image here on the left is from a garbage bin. It clearly says garbage. That's what it's for. But then underneath it, they're talking about zero waste and recyclable and compostable. That is not the place to talk about whatever messaging you want. People are going to start. The immediate question is, well, what is it for? Is it for zero waste or is it for garbage? This image here on the left is from my airport here in Charleston, where they thought more signage labels would be better than not, but it just leads to total confusion. You have paper recycling up here, newspaper magazine underneath it. You don't need to have both of those. Drink recycle. I don't know what drink recycle is. So the verbiage itself is a clear language that people will recognize. That some of this starts to get to a cultural level too of just what information is most familiar to people. But you don't need to have plastic bottles and aluminum cans down here if you're going to have drink recycle right there. Having two different layers of information is confusing, and having other recycle and then trash only. Enough said with this one. So those are just some general principles. I'll give one last chance if anybody has anything else they want to raise. Go ahead and speak up.
There's a question in the chat. Is there an ideal font size for a flyer or a sign?
I'm sorry, I missed that. Can you say that one more time?
It's not my question, so Ryan, feel free to jump in, but is there an ideal font size for a flyer or signage on a container?
Good question. I don't think I don't think one can point to a specific font necessarily. It really is just more the judgment call. It's in that setting. If you're standing, if you go back to that image I showed earlier on of as people approach, what information do you want them to have at what stage? When somebody is 10 or 15 feet away, you want them to be able to see, this bin is for paper, or this bin is for compostables. And so you've got to have font that's going to be large enough to be read from that distance as people are approaching and they're formulating, I'm going to toss something away. And that's where they need to know there's a choice to be made and what the different options are. So I think it comes down to just measuring that out and seeing what that looks like for your situation, but then taking the more detailed information of it is plastic bottles, it is aluminum cans, etc. That kind of information could be much smaller. Can you see that from 2-3 feet away is where you're going to go. So that's how I'd respond to that.
I put in a couple questions to the chat as well. Just off the topic, like any other selling points to organizations where we're trying to persuade them to have better signage besides better diversion rates?
I mean, certainly the contamination is becoming a huge issue where haulers are refusing to collect material, or where there are fees or fines for contaminated material. That's an obvious one. Beyond that, it's communicating that whether or not it's a concern of yours, your material is going into the general system, and it doesn't just make it difficult to collect, to recycle the items that are being generated at your facility, but you're adding a problem and complexity to the overall recycling system. In a sense, you're dragging down the whole system when you allow contamination to become a big problem. So there's almost kind of a civic component to that. It's a little hard to answer if decision makers are not concerned about recycling. It's hard to say what's going to motivate them specifically. But I think just trying to make that case that the recycling system only functions as well as the things that are put into it. And when things are dirty, we start to see problems like we've seen over the last 3-4 years with all these news stories about recyclables having to go to the landfill because they were too contaminated, or China no longer wants our recyclables. That all comes down at the end of the day to this issue of contamination, which is it has a certain existential threat to the recycling system, that it's more than just simply whether the items in one bin are going to be tossed out or not.
That's an excellent answer. I was also going to add, like, it causes, if it was like in the office example, it causes your employees frustration as well. So that's another one. No, but that was really good. And my second one was, are there any accessibility considerations? I said, like eye level for most may not be eye level for all, or color coded might not work for colorblind folks.
Yeah, good question. More research needs to go into this. What I have seen along this is, part of it has to do with the making sure it's easy to see, having it at eye level, but also not just at eye level, but also having something that is down lower. If somebody's in a wheelchair, at their eye level is also something to consider. I've seen one example of somebody who came up with mats that could go on the ground that were sort of a form of braille for folks to use with their feet, where they could feel out what was on there, because of the concern that you could put braille onto the side of the bin, but if you don't have the ability, if you're visually challenged, you're not any more excited about wanting to put your fingers all over a gross trash bin than you are than anybody else is. So that's a tough one. The other consideration is certainly having the openings be on the side as opposed to on the top. That can be a factor. If somebody's in a wheelchair, their ability to actually access and reach in, you want to make that easier. Having I can't remember the exact height, but there is a specific height that's been suggested for where you want to have that opening for greater accessibility. But I would love to hear if anybody else has thoughts along these lines as well. Oh, my colleague has put in here that that we have done labels and bins with Braille on them before. Yeah, I would love to hear from anybody else who's done that. Great. Well, we're about 15 minutes over. I want to thank everybody, Roshana, Oge, and Jessica for throwing your questions out, and everybody else for joining. We'd love to get your feedback. This is sort of experimental to see if this format would work, if this was interactive. Would love to get your feedback. Was this helpful just to sit in and listen to others? Any suggestion how we might tweak this? Is this worth doing this format in the future? We will be sending out a survey to everybody after the program, or certainly within the next day. So I encourage folks to fill that out and give us feedback. And thank you for coming. And we'll hopefully see everybody next month with our program focused on food organics on April 6th. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Alec.
Thank you.